AM 560. The Answer.
All right. Listen up. We're going to learn something from Shelby Steele. Have you read White Guilt, Kristen McCreary?
No, I'm familiar with the
Read it.
framework. Okay.
Everybody read White Guilt and all of other Shelby Steele's other work, but start with White Guilt. You want to understand the kneel downs in the NFL before the flag, before the anthem. You want to understand Draymond Green's comment about not using the word owner to describe NBA owners because it has a slave connotation. You want to understand how gun owners are vilified in this America. Why? You want to understand modern liberalism. Shelby Steele gave a 45-minute talk at the Heritage Foundation the other day, which is excellent because he's one of the most important deep thinkers in this country. And, of course, he's underappreciated because he's African-American conservative. But he wasn't always. I mean, he's a 70-year-old man. He grew up during Jim Crow. He was part of the civil rights movement. He was affiliated with the Black Panthers, or certainly interested in them during his time in college. And he susses out modern liberalism in a very, he provides very important insights into it. He calls modern liberalism on the Madame Bovary arc. And if you haven't read Madame Bovary, Flaubert's novel, you should read that too. Here's him describing what he's talking about.
Madame Bovary, on the other hand, feels that she is better than this, and that she, in that sense, puts herself above her fate, which is to live in this sort of ordinary world, and she begins to sort of project idealisms onto the world. Visions of a perfect love, a perfect romance, high life in Paris, hotels, lavish dinners, beautiful clothes, and so forth. And she begins to sort of rob Peter to pay Paul, and to pay for all of this, because she begins to act it out. She takes on lovers and so forth. Then, of course, the house of cards finally collapses, and she can no longer borrow from Peter to pay Paul. Her lovers reject her, see her as a nuisance. She comes home one night, takes a handful of arsenic, and administers it to herself, and dies a rather wretched death.
Sorry for the spoiler alert there if you were going to read Madame Bovary, but you get the arc. Empty idealisms pursued without foundation, and ultimately they're discovered to be just that, empty and fleeting and not connected to reality. And that ordinary life that she left, that was filled with responsibility and commitment, is the life that actually provides real value and is tethered to something important. So Steele describing America's Madame Bovary fall.
I believe that this liberalism was born of a profoundly transformative moral fall that occurred in America in the 1960s, that America endured. From a vision of itself as a great and fair nation, there was a fall to a certain knowledge of its dark underside.
So the key idea, the new idea that came out of the 60s, is that America is fundamentally evil. And this is what informs modern liberalism.
All of this dissent gave birth to what I think is a brand new idea that had not been a part of American life and culture before this time. And that idea was that America was guilty of characterological evil. That is to say, it wasn't a country that just now and then responded to evil or acted in that way. It was a country in which evil was endemic, was a part of the character, was a means of doing business in society.
And so modern liberalism is moral liberalism that is positioned against evil America. And obviously, if you're not part of the crew that believes America is characterologically evil, as Shelby Steele said, well, then you're part of the evil. And so what does this give rise to? There are two effects of this. One is bad faith.
American evil, in that sense, makes also a virtue out of bad faith. If America's evil, it is virtuous to have bad faith and to be suspicious and cynical and mistrustful of American authority, of America's moral legitimacy.
And the second consequence is exactly where he was leading, the loss of any moral authority, the elimination of moral authority.
The second effect is a profound loss of moral authority in America. You know, if you can think of, it's not complicated. You've heard it a million times. Here's the Founding Fathers writing some of the most glorious documents about human freedom ever written on a level, the biblical level, timeless, and many of them owned slaves. Many of them had relationships with slaves, had children with slaves. Jefferson, for example, who wrote, "All men are created equal." Well, the 60s fall made America accountable to this hypocrisy. And America began to lose the moral authority it needed to enforce its own best principles and values. And we have never, since that time, completely gained back the moral authority to ask difficult things of other Americans, of ourselves and of our fellow Americans.
So the present fallenness, if you will, that Shelby Steele describes, is an obsession with past sins in America that can, that provide the basis to continue to characterize America as evil, and thus the modern liberal as virtuous. And then it creates a fear of being judged for those past sins. Mm-hmm. And that's what we see rampant throughout society. That's what all of what you're seeing, these are manifestations of precisely what Steele is talking about from the modern left, which is totalitarian. A concrete example of modern liberalism, Chicago. Shelby Steele grew up on the south side of Chicago.
We saw it, I think, very tragically in Chicago recently. Last year in Chicago, 2016, over 4,000 people were shot with guns. Over 860 some were killed. 1 year in 5 neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago, where I grew up. Now, when I grew up there, I never saw a gun. Ever. They may have been there. I don't know. I didn't see any. I lived there. Well, that's a serious, deep problem of a people almost self-immolating. And there are many complex sources of a problem like that, that sort of willful, nihilistic self-destruction. And what does the mayor do? He puts forward a resolution to have Chicago declared a sanctuary city. Sanctuary city. Well, that's modern liberalism. Again, the use, the gimmickry, to get back to chase moral authority through these silly little devices.
And he goes on to describe what modern liberalism really is.
Liberalism, I think, has effectively become the new racism. It mimics segregation by seeing blacks as helpless inferiors. Black inferiority is its greatest sort of cause, its greatest raison d'etre.
Wish we had more time to discuss this and to go through more of his speech, but you get the sense of it, just trying to give you that logical thread, the argument that he's making, and the manifestations that you see in your everyday walk of life, or certainly on the cable news channels and in media outlets throughout the web, that this is the basis. This is the understanding of the effects that you see playing themselves out in all corners of American life today.
And he suggests in a March column that ran in the Wall Street Journal that Trump's election was really an exhaustion with all of this, with an exhaustion with the idea, and I'm quoting him, of white guilt and the drama of culpability, innocence, and correctness in which it mires us. And he talks about the liberal movement of the 1950s and 60s being a dignified, liberal protest for civil rights, and today's marches, quote, marked by incoherence and downright lunacy, hats designed to evoke sexual organs, poems that scream in anger yet have no point to make, and a hysterical anti-Americanism. That sounds about right, doesn't it?
It does, and the cultural deference, which is the column that you're referring to, and that's the centerpiece of Steele's argument there, the cultural deference to modern liberalism is cultural suicide. Coming up.